The grand hall of the royal palace glittered beneath hundreds of golden lanterns. Music drifted through the air, laughter echoed from every corner. Nobles from distant territories stood together beneath towering banners, speaking proudly about the future of the kingdom. It was supposed to be a celebration, a night honoring strength, a night honoring leadership, a night honoring the next generation. Yet among all the smiling faces, there was one person nobody seemed to notice. The Alpha King's youngest son stood quietly near the edge of the hall. Alone, invisible, forgotten. People walked around him without acknowledging his presence. Servants hurried past him carrying silver trays. Nobles glanced at him briefly before turning away. Even children from powerful families avoided standing too close. The prince had grown accustomed to it. Years of silence had taught him many things. The most painful lesson of all was that people rarely looked beyond what they could immediately understand. And because he could not speak, most had already decided what kind of person he must be. Weak, slow, broken, a disappointment. The cruel assumptions followed him everywhere. No one said them directly in front of him anymore. They assumed he could not understand, but he understood everything, every whisper, every pitying glance, every hidden expression. He noticed far more than anyone realized. That was what happened when a person spent years being ignored. They learned to observe. The prince watched two noblemen standing nearby. One smiled politely while speaking about loyalty to the throne, but the prince noticed the man's clenched jaw. The nervous tapping of his fingers, the way his eyes repeatedly shifted toward another group across the room. Small details, tiny things, things nobody else noticed. The prince noticed all of them, because observing people had become his only form of conversation. Across the hall, the Alpha King stood before a gathering of influential leaders, tall, respected, powerful. The ruler carried the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. Every noble listened carefully whenever he spoke. Every warrior respected his commands. Every citizen admired his strength. Yet despite standing only a short distance away, the prince felt farther from his father than anyone else in the room. The king never mistreated him. That almost made it worse. There was no cruelty, no anger, no hatred. Only distance, cold distance, the kind that slowly hollowed out a person's heart. The king rarely looked directly at him during public events, rarely approached him, rarely included him, not because he didn't care. The prince knew better than most. His father cared, but he cared in silence. Behind closed doors, in ways that never seemed to reach the places that mattered, the kingdom respected strength, and somewhere along the way the king had become afraid that showing too much affection toward a mute heir would invite weakness into the eyes of others. The result was a loneliness neither father nor son knew how to overcome. The prince lowered his gaze. The celebration continued around him. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed. A servant suddenly approached. The older man offered a polite bow before gesturing toward a side corridor. The meaning was obvious. The prince wasn't being ordered away, not directly, yet the message remained the same. The important guests were gathering. The future leaders of the kingdom would soon be honored. Perhaps it would be better if the prince watched from somewhere else. Somewhere less visible. The servant avoided eye contact. Even he seemed uncomfortable. The prince simply nodded. He was used to this. Disappointment no longer arrived as a sharp wound. It arrived as something quieter, something familiar, like rain on stone. As he turned toward the corridor, movement near the entrance caught his attention. A young woman had just entered the hall. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't immediately focused on the king or the nobles or the celebration. Her eyes moved across the room carefully, observing, studying, almost as if she were searching for something. The prince paid little attention at first. New faces appeared often. Most stayed only long enough to join the crowd of people who ignored him. There was no reason to expect anything different. Yet something about her felt unusual. She wasn't smiling for appearances, wasn't rushing to impress anyone. She simply looked around with genuine curiosity. Moments later, her gaze landed on him. The prince immediately looked away. Experience had taught him what came next. Pity, awkwardness, discomfort, then avoidance. It always happened, every single time. But several seconds passed. No footsteps moved away, no uncomfortable expressions appeared. When he glanced back, she was still looking at him. Not with pity, not with judgment. Just curiosity, real curiosity, the kind he had not seen directed toward him in years. For reasons he couldn't explain, that made him nervous. The young woman eventually continued walking deeper into the hall, yet she occasionally glanced in his direction. Not enough to attract attention, just enough for him to notice, and for the first time in a very long while, someone else's attention lingered in his thoughts. The evening progressed. The celebration grew louder. Speeches began. Applause filled the hall. The prince remained where he always remained, at the edge of everything, watching, listening, observing. Hours passed. Then something unexpected happened. During one of the speeches, a nobleman spoke proudly about leadership and intelligence. As the audience applauded, the prince noticed several inaccuracies in the man's claims, details nobody else seemed aware of. He couldn't stop himself from reacting. A small shake of his head, a slight expression of disbelief. Nothing dramatic, just an honest response. Yet someone saw it. The young woman. From across the room, she noticed immediately. Not only that, she seemed to understand what it meant. The prince felt a strange unease. People rarely paid enough attention to notice his expressions. This woman did, again and again, as if she understood that his silence didn't mean emptiness. It meant there were thoughts nobody had ever bothered to hear. The celebration finally ended near midnight. Guests slowly dispersed. The hall emptied. The prince slipped away before anyone could stop him. The palace corridors felt quieter, safer. Moonlight spilled through tall windows as he walked. These halls were familiar. Predictable, unlike people. People were difficult. People disappointed him. Corridors did not. He followed a path toward the royal gardens. The gardens had become his refuge years ago, a place where expectations disappeared. Flowers didn't judge. Trees didn't pity him. The stars never looked away. For a little while, he could simply exist, nothing more, nothing less. The prince settled beside a stone fountain. The water reflected the moonlight. The kingdom slept peacefully around him. At least most of it did. He stared at the rippling surface. Sometimes he imagined what life might have been like if he could speak. Would things have been different? Would his father have looked at him differently? Would people have listened? Or would they have found another reason to dismiss him? The questions had no answers. Only silence. Always silence. A sound interrupted his thoughts. Footsteps. The prince turned, his body instantly tensed. Someone was approaching. The young woman stepped into the garden. For a moment, neither moved, neither spoke. The prince considered leaving. That was usually easier, safer. People eventually disappointed him. Distance prevented disappointment. But before he could rise, the young woman slowly sat on a nearby bench, far enough away to avoid making him uncomfortable, close enough to acknowledge his presence. Moonlight illuminated the fountain between them, still no words, no awkward attempts at conversation, no forced sympathy, just quiet. The prince found that strangely comforting. Several minutes passed, then she did something unexpected. She raised one hand. Slowly, carefully, and formed a simple gesture. The prince froze. His entire body went still. His heartbeat stopped. No, not possible. His eyes widened. The gesture had meaning, a real meaning, a familiar meaning, one he hadn't seen directed toward him in years. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But then she repeated it, again, deliberately, clearly. A greeting, sign language. The prince stared at her. Shock flooded through him. Not because someone knew sign language, but because someone was actually using it with him. Nobody did that. Nobody. Teachers had given up years ago. Servants never learned. Nobles didn't care enough. Even members of the royal household rarely used more than a handful of basic signs. Yet this stranger knew it, and more importantly, she was speaking directly to him. The prince felt something dangerous begin to rise inside his chest. Hope. Dangerous because hope could be lost. Dangerous because hope could hurt. His hands trembled slightly. The young woman seemed to notice. She immediately lowered her gaze, giving him space, giving him time. Not pressuring him, not demanding a response. The kindness of that simple gesture nearly broke him. Years of loneliness suddenly felt heavier than ever before, because for the first time he realized just how lonely he had truly been. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his hands. His movements felt rusty, unused, almost forgotten. Then he answered. A simple response. Small, careful, yet it carried more emotion than any spoken sentence ever could. The young woman's eyes widened slightly, not with surprise, with happiness. She understood him, actually understood him. The realization hit the prince harder than anything he had experienced in years. For so long he had existed behind an invisible wall, watching everyone else live, watching everyone else connect, watching everyone else be heard. Now, suddenly, someone stood on the other side. Someone had found a door. Tears threatened to form in his eyes. He fought them back immediately. The young woman continued signing slowly, patiently, introducing herself, explaining that she had learned sign language years earlier from a relative who could not hear. The prince watched every movement carefully, almost afraid she might disappear if he blinked. Conversation. Real conversation. Not guessing, not pointing, not expressions, conversation. For the first time in years, the garden seemed impossibly quiet around them. The fountain continued flowing. The moon continued shining. Yet the prince felt as if his entire world had changed. And somewhere beyond the garden walls, unseen eyes watched from a distant palace window. A figure stood hidden in darkness, observing, watching the interaction unfold, watching the mute prince communicate, watching someone finally understand him. The figure's expression darkened because the silent boy was never supposed to have a voice, and if someone could finally understand what he knew, years of carefully hidden secrets might not remain hidden much longer. The prince knew nothing of the danger yet. At that moment, he only knew one thing. For the first time in his life, someone was listening, and that single moment would change the fate of the kingdom forever. The following morning felt different, not because anything in the palace had changed. The same servants moved through the corridors, the same guards stood at their posts, the same nobles filled the royal halls with polished smiles and carefully chosen words. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. Yet for the first time in many years, the prince woke with something unfamiliar resting inside his heart. Anticipation. For most of his life, every day had felt nearly identical. Silence, observation, isolation. He had long ago stopped expecting anything more. But now a single possibility lingered in his thoughts. Someone understood him. Someone could hear the words trapped behind years of silence. The realization followed him everywhere, even during breakfast, even while walking through the palace gardens, even while sitting alone in the royal library where he often spent hours reading while the rest of the kingdom forgot he existed. Again and again, his mind returned to the same question. Would she come back? Hope was dangerous. He knew that better than anyone. Hope had disappointed him many times before. Yet despite every warning inside his mind, he found himself waiting, watching, looking toward every doorway, listening for footsteps, searching for a familiar face. Hours passed, then finally he saw her. The young woman entered the library carrying several books. At first, she appeared unaware of his presence. Then her eyes found him. A small smile appeared, simple, warm, genuine. The prince felt something loosen inside his chest. No pity, No awkwardness, no hesitation, just recognition, as if seeing him mattered, as if his presence meant something. The feeling was almost overwhelming. She approached slowly and settled into a nearby chair. Several moments passed before she raised her hands. A familiar greeting. The prince responded immediately, far more confidently than the night before. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it felt more meaningful than entire years spent among people who had never truly spoken to him. Their conversations began simply. Questions, observations, small pieces of everyday life. The young woman never treated him like a child, never simplified her thoughts, never assumed he understood less because he communicated differently. That alone made her different from almost everyone else. For years, people had spoken around him instead of to him. Now someone was finally speaking directly to him, and she quickly discovered something the rest of the palace had missed. The prince was exceptionally intelligent, not because he possessed extraordinary knowledge, but because he noticed things. Details, patterns, small changes others ignored. Years of silence had sharpened his awareness until it became almost impossible for him not to observe everything around him. As they continued communicating, she became increasingly fascinated. The prince remembered conversations from months earlier. He remembered specific expressions, specific gestures, specific reactions. His memory seemed almost impossible, yet it wasn't talent, it was survival. When speaking was impossible, listening became everything. The young woman soon realized the palace had misunderstood him his entire life. The kingdom saw weakness. She saw insight. The kingdom saw silence. She saw understanding. The kingdom saw limitation. She saw strength. Day after day, their conversations grew longer. The prince began spending less time alone. The library became their meeting place, sometimes the gardens, sometimes a quiet balcony overlooking the city, places where they could communicate freely without attracting too much attention. At first, few people noticed. Then people began talking. Palaces thrived on gossip, and gossip moved faster than any messenger. Servants whispered about the mysterious young woman who spent time with the mute prince. Guards exchanged curious glances. Nobles began paying attention. Some found the friendship touching. Others found it strange. A few found it concerning. The prince noticed every reaction, as always. He noticed which servants smiled warmly whenever they saw them together. He noticed which nobles suddenly lowered their voices when he entered a room. Most importantly, he noticed which people looked nervous. The nervous ones interested him, because nervous people often had something to hide. One afternoon, the young woman asked him a simple question. It seemed harmless at first. She wanted to know what he enjoyed most about the palace. The prince thought carefully, then his answer surprised her. He told her he liked watching people, not because he enjoyed judging them, because people revealed who they truly were when they believed nobody was paying attention. The young woman found the response unexpected. The prince explained further. For years, everyone had assumed he wasn't paying attention. That mistake had allowed him to witness countless things: arguments, secrets, private meetings, moments of honesty hidden beneath public masks. People often revealed their true selves around those they considered unimportant, and few people were considered more unimportant than a mute prince. The thought saddened her, yet it also sparked curiosity. How much had he seen? How much did he know? The answer turned out to be far more than either of them expected. Several days later, their conversation shifted toward palace politics. Not intentionally. The subject emerged naturally after witnessing a heated disagreement between two noble families. The prince observed the argument quietly. Then he signed something that made the young woman pause. He explained that the disagreement wasn't genuine. The two families pretended to oppose each other publicly. Privately, they met often, very often. The young woman frowned. How could he know that? The prince calmly described multiple occasions over the previous year when he had seen members of both families entering the same restricted corridors late at night. His recollection was precise. Dates, locations, patterns, everything. The information felt strange, uncomfortable, not necessarily dangerous, but unusual. Very unusual. The young woman initially dismissed it as coincidence, until similar observations began appearing again. And again. And again. The prince seemed capable of connecting details nobody else noticed: a missing document, an unexplained meeting. A servant suddenly transferred to another section of the palace. Individually, none of the details seemed important. Together they formed patterns, and the patterns pointed towards something hidden beneath the surface of palace life, something nobody wanted examined too closely. One evening they sat overlooking the city as sunset painted the sky gold. The kingdom appeared peaceful below. Citizens moved through busy streets, merchants closed shops, families returned home. From a distance, everything seemed perfect, yet the prince's attention remained fixed elsewhere. Toward a particular tower inside the palace grounds, the young woman noticed. She asked about it. The prince hesitated, then he shared something he had never told anyone. Several months earlier, he had witnessed a secret meeting inside that tower. Nothing unusual about that by itself. Palaces hosted countless private meetings. But this one felt different. The people involved had acted strangely, carefully, almost fearfully. The prince had observed from a distance, hidden, ignored, invisible, the way he always was. He remembered seeing several high-ranking nobles entering separately, then leaving separately, as though trying to avoid attention. At the time, he hadn't understood its significance. Now he wasn't so sure. The young woman listened carefully. For the first time, genuine concern appeared in her expression. Not because of what he had seen, because of what it might mean. The prince had spent years gathering pieces of information without realizing it. Now those pieces were beginning to connect, and someone else was helping him understand their significance. That changed everything. Unfortunately, they were not the only ones paying attention. Elsewhere in the palace, whispers continued spreading. The friendship had become impossible to ignore. Several nobles quietly questioned why the young woman spent so much time with the prince. Others wondered what exactly they discussed. A few individuals appeared particularly interested, too interested. The prince noticed them immediately. One nobleman repeatedly appeared near locations where they met. A palace advisor began asking servants unusual questions. Several guards changed their normal patrol routes. Individually insignificant, together suspicious. The prince shared his observations. The young woman felt unease growing inside her. Someone was watching, not openly, carefully, patiently, waiting. The question was why. Days later, another unexpected development occurred. The Alpha King finally noticed the change in his son. At first it was subtle. The prince carried himself differently. His posture seemed stronger, his expressions more confident. The emptiness that had haunted him for years had begun fading. The king couldn't ignore it. For the first time in a long while, he found himself watching his son. Really watching. And what he saw troubled him. Not because the change was bad, because he realized how much he had missed. The prince wasn't broken, wasn't weak, wasn't incapable. Somehow, somewhere, the king had allowed himself to believe the assumptions of others. Now those assumptions were crumbling, and their collapse left behind guilt, a great deal of guilt. The king began asking questions. The answers always led back to the same person. The young woman. He didn't know whether to be grateful or suspicious, perhaps both. Meanwhile, the prince continued revealing observations, each one slightly more concerning than the last. Then came the moment everything changed. It happened during a rainy afternoon in the library. The palace felt unusually quiet. Storm clouds darkened the windows. Most people remained indoors. The prince and the young woman sat alone among towering shelves of books. Their conversation drifted toward memories, old observations, forgotten details. Then suddenly the prince remembered something, a specific memory, one he had never considered important before. His expression changed immediately. the young woman noticed. Concern crossed her face. The prince quickly began signing. His movements grew faster, more urgent. As the memory resurfaced, he realized what it meant. Years earlier, a respected royal official had disappeared unexpectedly. The official's disappearance had shocked the kingdom. No explanation was ever provided. Most assumed he had left voluntarily. Others believed he died during travel. Eventually, people stopped asking questions. The prince had done the same. Until now, because he suddenly remembered seeing that official shortly before his disappearance. Not alone. With members of the secret group connected to the tower meetings. At the time, it seemed meaningless. Now it didn't. Now it felt important. Very important. The young woman's heart began racing. She asked careful questions. The prince answered everyone. His recollections remained astonishingly detailed, and with each answer, the situation became more alarming. The missing official had apparently discovered something dangerous, something powerful people desperately wanted hidden. The prince couldn't prove it. Not yet. But the possibility alone changed everything. For several moments, neither moved. Rain struck the windows. Thunder echoed in the distance. The library suddenly felt much colder. The young woman finally understood the truth. The prince wasn't merely an overlooked child. He was a witness. A witness who had spent years collecting secrets without realizing their value. And if even half of his observations were accurate, certain individuals inside the palace had every reason to fear him. Because now someone could finally understand what he knew. Outside the library, hidden beyond the doorway, a shadow moved silently away. Someone had been listening, not to the entire conversation, but enough. Enough to understand that the mute prince had become a threat. Enough to realize that his silence was no longer protecting anyone, and enough to know that something would need to be done before more secrets surfaced. Inside the library, neither the prince nor the young woman noticed. They remained focused on the growing mystery before them, unaware that the danger surrounding them had just become very real. And somewhere deep within the palace, powerful eyes were beginning to turn toward the silent prince at last, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with fear. Because the boy everyone ignored had started finding his voice, and the truth he carried threatened far more than either of them yet understood. The palace no longer felt the same. For most of his life, the prince had moved through its halls like a ghost, ignored, overlooked, forgotten. Now, for the first time, people were watching him. Not everyone, not openly, but enough for him to notice. And if there was one thing the prince understood better than anyone else, it was being watched. Years of observing others had taught him how attention changed people. How fear changed them, how secrets changed them. The difference now was that he had become the subject of those changes. The morning after the discovery in the library, he walked through the eastern corridor on his way to the gardens. The route was familiar. He had taken it hundreds of times, yet something felt wrong. 3 guards stood near a staircase where usually only one stood watch. 2 palace advisors ended their conversation the moment he approached. A servant carrying documents accidentally dropped several pages after seeing him. The reactions lasted only seconds, small moments, tiny details, but details mattered. The prince noticed all of them. He always did. When he finally reached the gardens, the young woman was already waiting. The moment she saw his expression, concern crossed her face. He immediately began signing. The changes, the stares, the unusual behavior. Everything. She listened carefully. Her concern deepened. The previous day's discovery had already unsettled her. Now it seemed their fears might have been justified. Someone knew they were asking questions. Someone knew the prince remembered things, and someone clearly didn't like it. The realization settled heavily between them. For several moments, neither continued. The fountain nearby trickled softly. Birds moved among the trees. The peaceful surroundings felt strangely disconnected from the growing tension inside the palace. Finally, the young woman signed something simple. A question. Did he want to stop? The prince stared at her. then slowly shook his head. No. For years, nobody had listened. For years, nobody had cared what he knew. Now someone finally did. He couldn't return to silence. Not anymore. Something had changed inside him. Something important. For the first time in his life, his thoughts felt valuable. His observations mattered. His voice existed, not spoken, not heard through sound, but real nonetheless. And once a person discovered their voice, losing it became unbearable. The young woman understood immediately. Whatever danger existed, the prince would not walk away. Not now, not after finally being seen. Over the following days, their conversations grew longer than ever. The prince shared memory after memory. Some appeared insignificant. Others felt deeply troubling. A nobleman secretly entering restricted sections of the palace, an advisor exchanging sealed documents late at night, meetings occurring far too frequently to be coincidence. Each story alone meant little. Together, they created a pattern. A pattern neither of them fully understood, yet both sensed something larger hiding beneath it. Meanwhile, another change was occurring. The prince himself was changing. For years, loneliness had wrapped around him like chains. He had learned to expect disappointment, to expect rejection, to expect people to leave. Now those expectations were slowly breaking apart. The transformation was subtle at first. He looked people in the eyes more often. His posture seemed stronger. His expressions carried greater confidence. Most importantly, he no longer avoided attention, not because he wanted it, because he no longer feared it as much. The young woman noticed immediately. So did others, especially the Alpha King. The king found himself watching his son more frequently. At first, he couldn't understand what had changed. The prince was still silent, still communicated through signs, still moved through the palace quietly, yet somehow he seemed different, stronger, brighter, more alive. The realization troubled the king in ways he struggled to explain. One evening, standing alone in his private chambers, he found himself staring through a window overlooking the courtyard below. The prince sat beneath a tree, speaking through signs with the young woman. The king watched from afar. Something tightened painfully inside his chest. Years. Years had passed without him truly seeing his own son. He had convinced himself distance was necessary, that protecting the kingdom required difficult sacrifices, that public displays of affection might invite weakness. Now those excuses felt hollow, because a stranger had accomplished in weeks what he had failed to accomplish in years. She had reached his son. She had given him confidence. She had given him hope. And the king wasn't sure whether that realization hurt more because it was true, or because he had no defense against it. Across the palace, others reached different conclusions. Not everyone welcomed the prince's growing confidence. A handful of powerful individuals viewed it as a problem. One evening, several influential nobles gathered in a private chamber. The meeting remained hidden from most of the palace. Yet hidden meetings rarely stayed hidden forever. Not when servants carried food, not when guards changed positions, not when people talked. The prince didn't witness the gathering directly, but he noticed the signs afterward. Several participants emerged looking tense, others appeared angry, one seemed frightened. The reactions interested him. Later, while discussing the day's events with the young woman, he shared his observations. The young woman's concern deepened further. The timing felt wrong. Too many unusual events were occurring simultaneously, too many nervous people, too many secrets, and every path seemed to lead back toward the same hidden network operating within the palace. The question was no longer whether something was happening. The question was how dangerous it truly was. Days passed. Then the pressure began. At first, it appeared harmless. A palace official suggested the young woman spend less time with the prince. Another offered her responsibilities elsewhere. A noblewoman politely questioned whether such frequent meetings were appropriate. Individually, the comments seemed innocent. Together, they formed a clear message. People wanted distance between them. The young woman recognized it immediately. So did the prince. Neither mentioned it at first. Neither wanted to acknowledge what it meant. Eventually, they could no longer ignore it. Someone was actively trying to separate them. The realization unsettled both. Because if people were working this hard to silence their conversations, then those conversations must be revealing something important. Very important. One afternoon, the prince arrived at the library expecting another meeting. Instead, he found the doors locked. That had never happened before. Confused, he searched elsewhere. The gardens, closed for maintenance. The balcony overlooking the city, restricted. One location after another suddenly became unavailable. Coincidence was possible, but unlikely. The prince knew better. Someone was creating obstacles, not large enough to attract attention, just enough to disrupt, just enough to interfere. When he finally located the young woman hours later, she revealed something equally troubling. She had been reassigned temporarily to duties in another section of the palace. No explanation, no warning, no reason. The pattern was becoming impossible to deny. The prince felt anger rising, a rare emotion for him. Years of silence had taught patience. Years of neglect had taught endurance. But this felt different. For the first time, he had something worth protecting, and someone was trying to take it away. That realization awakened a determination even he didn't know he possessed. The young woman noticed immediately. The boy who once accepted every disappointment without resistance was gone. Something stronger had taken his place. Not arrogance, not defiance. Conviction. The belief that his voice mattered. The belief that he deserved to be heard. The belief that he would not disappear simply because others preferred him silent. Meanwhile, the mystery continued deepening. One evening, while reviewing old records in the archives, the young woman discovered something alarming. Several documents connected to the missing royal official had vanished, not misplaced, removed, carefully, deliberately. The absence itself became evidence. Someone had erased information. Someone had worked hard to ensure certain questions remained unanswered. When she shared the discovery with the prince, his reaction was immediate. A memory surfaced. Another fragment. Another piece of the puzzle. Years earlier, shortly before the official disappeared, the prince had witnessed a heated argument. At the time, he hadn't understood its significance. Now, everything felt different. The memory returned with startling clarity. The missing official had argued with a senior palace advisor, an advisor who remained highly influential even today. The prince remembered their expressions, the tension, the anger. Most importantly, he remembered fear. The official had looked frightened, not frustrated, not annoyed, frightened. The detail changed everything, because fear suggested knowledge, dangerous knowledge. The young woman listened carefully. A chill ran through her. The pattern was becoming clearer and far more dangerous. The missing official had likely uncovered something connected to powerful people, something worth hiding. The prince didn't possess proof, yet his observations kept pointing in the same direction. Again and again. The same names, the same meetings, the same suspicious behavior, the same network. The pieces were slowly forming a picture. Unfortunately, the closer they came to understanding that picture, the greater the danger became. Late one night. The prince returned to his chambers after an unusually long day. The corridor outside stood empty, silent, dark. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed it, a folded piece of paper resting near his door. His heartbeat slowed. Carefully, he approached. The note contained only a few words, no signature, no explanation. Just a warning that certain questions should remain unanswered. The prince stared at the message. For several moments, he couldn't move. Fear crept through him. Cold, heavy, unwelcome. Someone knew. Someone was watching closely enough to leave threats outside his private chambers. The realization shook him deeply. For years he had been invisible. Now invisibility was gone, and danger had taken its place. The following day he showed the note to the young woman. Her expression immediately darkened. The situation had escalated. No longer suspicion, no longer uncertainty. Someone was actively attempting to intimidate them. The prince expected her to tell him to stop, to walk away, to protect himself. Instead, she surprised him. Though fear remained visible in her eyes, she refused to abandon him. The gesture meant more than words could express, because everyone else had eventually walked away. Everyone, teachers, servants, friends, even family. Yet she stayed. The prince felt something powerful settle inside his heart. Trust. Perhaps for the first time in his life. True trust, but danger continued growing, and neither realized how close they were to uncovering the truth. The breakthrough came several days later, almost by accident. While reviewing old palace schedules, the young woman noticed a strange inconsistency. A date, a location, a meeting. At first it seemed meaningless, then she compared it against the prince's memories. Suddenly everything aligned. The secret tower meetings, the missing official, the vanished records. The same names appeared repeatedly. Again, and again, and again. The evidence remained incomplete, yet the pattern could no longer be ignored. Someone inside the palace had been operating a hidden network for years, a network connected to influence, secrecy, and possibly betrayal. The prince stared at the growing collection of notes. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from realization. His memories mattered. His observations mattered. The details everyone dismissed were revealing the truth. For years, people assumed silence meant weakness. Now that same silence had become the greatest threat to those hiding secrets. Because while everyone else talked, the prince had listened. While everyone else underestimated him, he had observed. While everyone else ignored him, he had remembered. The realization felt almost overwhelming. Yet before either could fully process it, another discovery emerged. One far more dangerous than anything before. A name. A single name appearing repeatedly across every suspicious event. Not a servant, not a minor noble. Someone much closer to the throne. Someone powerful enough to influence the entire kingdom. Someone trusted. The moment they recognized it, both froze. The implications were terrifying. If they were right, the corruption reached far higher than either imagined. Far higher. And for the first time since this journey began, the young woman truly understood the danger surrounding them. Because exposing ordinary secrets was one thing, exposing someone that powerful was another entirely. Outside the room, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Neither noticed. They remained focused on the revelation before them, unaware that hidden eyes were already moving into position. Unaware that powerful forces had decided they were no longer merely curious observers, they had become threats. And threats, in the world of palace politics, rarely survived for long. The truth was closer than ever. But so was the danger, and before the prince could finally be heard by the kingdom, someone would try very hard to silence him forever. The warning arrived before sunrise, not through words, not through a messenger, not through a formal royal decree. It arrived through absence. The prince stood in the eastern garden waiting beneath, the same flowering tree where he and the young woman often met. Morning mist drifted across the grass. The palace was still waking. Servants moved quietly through distant corridors. Birds sang from stone ledges overlooking the courtyard. Everything appeared normal, yet something felt wrong. The young woman was never late. Not once since their friendship began. The prince waited. 10 minutes. 20. 30. Still nothing. A knot tightened inside his chest. Concern slowly transformed into unease. Then unease became fear. By midday, he finally learned the truth. The young woman had been ordered away from the royal wing. Without warning, without explanation. Without permission to contact him. The decision had come directly from senior palace officials, officials who claimed the reassignment was temporary, necessary. Routine. The prince knew better. Nothing about this felt routine. Nothing about it felt accidental. Someone was separating them, finally, successfully. The realization hit him harder than he expected. For years, he had survived loneliness. Years. So why did losing one person hurt this much? Because she wasn't simply a friend. She had become something far more important. She was proof that he mattered, proof that he wasn't invisible, proof that someone could see him and still choose to stay. Now she was gone, and the silence returned. Only this time it felt heavier than before, much heavier, because now he knew what he was missing. The palace seemed colder over the following days. Every corridor felt emptier, every room felt larger. The prince wandered through familiar spaces that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The library no longer brought comfort. The gardens felt hollow. Even the city views from the palace balconies seemed distant. Colorless. For the first time since meeting her, old doubts began creeping back into his mind. Maybe nothing had changed. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe people like him were never meant to be heard. Those thoughts frightened him more than any threat. Because they felt familiar. The same beliefs that had imprisoned him for years. The same loneliness that had shaped his entire life. Meanwhile, elsewhere inside the palace, pressure continued mounting. The young woman faced constant scrutiny. Questions followed her everywhere. Her duties became increasingly restrictive. Several officials implied she had crossed boundaries. Others suggested she was interfering in matters beyond her understanding. Nobody openly threatened her. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they used something far more effective. Isolation, the same weapon used against the prince, the same weapon powerful people often used against anyone who became inconvenient. Yet despite everything, she refused to abandon him. Whenever possible, she continued searching for answers, continued examining records, continued connecting fragments, and the deeper she looked, the more disturbing the truth became. The hidden network inside the palace wasn't simply protecting secrets, it was protecting power. Years of power, years of manipulation, years of carefully controlled information. The missing official had come dangerously close to exposing it. Then he vanished. The prince had unknowingly inherited the pieces he left behind, and now powerful people were terrified. Back inside the royal wing, another battle was unfolding. The Eye. Alpha King could no longer ignore what was happening around him. For weeks he had watched events unfold from a distance. Now the situation had become impossible to dismiss. His son had changed. Everyone could see it. Yet, instead of celebrating that change, influential voices within the palace seemed determined to suppress it. The contradiction troubled him deeply. One evening, alone in his private chamber, the king reviewed reports from trusted guards. Small inconsistencies appeared throughout them: reassignments without explanation, restricted access orders, unusual meetings. None of it proved wrongdoing, yet together they painted an uncomfortable picture. Someone was acting without his full knowledge, inside his own palace. The realization ignited something dangerous: suspicion. For years, the king had trusted the people around him. Now that trust began cracking, and once cracks appear in trust, they rarely remain small. The following week delivered another blow. The prince received a second warning, this one far more direct. A sealed note awaited him inside his chamber. No signature. No name, only a simple message. Stop looking, stop remembering, or suffer the consequences. The prince stared at the words. Fear gripped him immediately. His hands trembled. His breathing grew uneven. The threat wasn't merely aimed at him. He knew that. It was aimed at the young woman as well. Anyone close to him could become a target. Anyone helping him could become vulnerable. The thought consumed him. For days he carried the burden alone, until eventually he managed to secretly meet the young woman again. The reunion should have felt joyful. Instead, it felt painful, because both immediately recognized how much had changed. The palace no longer viewed them as harmless. Their friendship had become dangerous. The prince showed her the note. Her expression hardened. Not with surprise, with certainty. She had expected something like this. That realization frightened him even more. For a long time, neither communicated. Neither knew what to say. Eventually, the prince signed a question. One simple question. Was it worth it? The young woman understood instantly. Was the truth worth all this suffering, all this fear, all this risk? For several moments, she couldn't answer. Because honestly, she didn't know. The situation had become larger than either of them anticipated. Yet after a long silence, she finally responded. Yes. Not because the truth was easy, because it mattered, and because people who spent their lives hiding behind fear only empowered those causing it. The prince wanted to believe her. He truly did. Yet doubt remained. The threats were working, little by little. Fear had begun poisoning hope, exactly as intended. Days later, everything finally collapsed. The hidden network made its move, not through violence, not through force, through manipulation. Rumors spread across the palace, whispers, accusations, stories designed to damage trust. Some claimed the young woman was influencing the prince for personal gain. Others suggested she sought political power. Several even implied she was feeding him false information. The rumors spread rapidly. Palaces thrived on uncertainty. People preferred comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The prince watched the consequences unfold. Servants who once smiled now avoided eye contact. Nobles whispered whenever he entered a room. Even some guards seemed uncertain. The isolation returned stronger than ever. Everywhere he looked, suspicion followed. The experience devastated him, not because strangers doubted him, because part of him had started believing he had finally escaped loneliness. Now loneliness had returned, worse than before, because hope had existed first. Hope always made loss more painful. One evening, overwhelmed by fear and disappointment, the prince retreated to the gardens alone. Rain clouds gathered overhead. Dark winds swept through the trees. The palace lights glowed in distant windows. He sat beside the fountain where everything had begun. The same fountain, the same stone, the same quiet water. Yet everything felt different. For a long time he stared into the reflection. His reflection stared back. Silent, lonely, small. The old version of himself seemed to be waiting beneath the surface. Waiting for surrender, waiting for acceptance, waiting for silence. Tears formed despite his efforts to stop them. He felt foolish, weak, broken. Perhaps the kingdom had been right all along. Perhaps people like him weren't meant to challenge powerful forces. Perhaps being heard had only brought pain. For the first time since meeting the young woman, he considered giving up. The thought settled heavily inside him, and that was exactly the moment everything changed. Because while the prince sat alone battling despair, the young woman made a discovery. A discovery so shocking it transformed the entire story. The breakthrough came from something seemingly insignificant, an old record, forgotten, misfiled, ignored. A document connected to the missing official, one document everyone else had overlooked. Inside was evidence of a financial investigation conducted years earlier. The official had been tracing missing resources, missing funds, missing supplies intended for distant territories. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Then the names emerged. The same names connected to the secret meetings, the same names connected to vanished records, the same names appearing throughout the prince's observations. But there was more. Far more. At the center of everything stood a single individual, not a noble, not a minister, not even a council member, someone far closer to the throne, someone trusted completely, someone who had spent years manipulating information while hiding behind loyalty. The revelation stunned her, because the true architect of the corruption wasn't who anyone suspected. It wasn't the network itself. The network served someone powerful, someone respected, someone hiding in plain sight. The young woman immediately sought the prince. Hours later, she found him still sitting beside the fountain, still trapped inside his despair, still believing everything had been lost. The moment she arrived, she began signing urgently. The prince looked confused, then concerned, then shocked. With every new detail, his eyes widened further. The truth unfolded piece by piece. The corruption, the disappearances, the missing records, the hidden meetings, everything connected, everything pointed toward the same individual. And suddenly, another memory surfaced, a memory buried deep within the prince's mind, one he had never shared, one he had never considered important. Until now. Years earlier, on the night before the missing official vanished, the prince had witnessed something unusual. A confrontation, brief, hidden, desperate. The official had met privately with the very person now connected to every piece of evidence. The prince remembered their expressions, the tension, the fear, the urgency. Most importantly, he remembered seeing the official hand over a sealed package. At the time, the memory meant nothing. Now it meant everything, because it proved contact, direct contact, the final missing piece. The young woman realized immediately what had happened. The official had discovered the truth. The confrontation occurred. Then he disappeared. Everything suddenly aligned. Years of mystery, years of secrecy, years of hidden manipulation. The prince sat frozen. His heart pounded. The realization felt overwhelming. Not only because the truth was horrifying, because he had carried the key to it for years, without knowing. All those years spent ignored, dismissed, overlooked. Yet his observations had preserved the evidence. His silence had protected the truth. The irony struck him deeply. The very people who underestimated him had created their own downfall, because they never imagined he was paying attention. They never imagined he remembered, and they never imagined someone would eventually listen. For the first time in days, hope returned, not gentle hope, powerful hope, the kind born from certainty, the kind capable of surviving fear, the kind capable of changing destinies. Yet danger remained, perhaps greater than ever, because now they possessed something far more dangerous than suspicion. They possessed understanding, and once powerful people realized the truth was finally within reach, they would do anything to stop it. Anything. The storm above the palace finally broke. Thunder echoed across the kingdom. Rain poured from dark skies. The prince looked toward the royal fortress rising against the night. For years he had lived as a shadow inside those walls. For years nobody listened. Nobody cared. Nobody saw him. Now the truth stood within reach, and for the first time in his life, the silent prince understood exactly who he was. Not a weakness, not a burden, not a forgotten child, a witness, a survivor. And soon, whether the kingdom was ready or not, the entire truth would finally be heard. The storm continued throughout the night. Rain hammered against the ancient stone walls of the palace. Thunder rolled across the kingdom like distant drums announcing the arrival of something inevitable. Inside the royal fortress, few people slept peacefully. Fear had begun moving through the halls, not the fear of enemies, not the fear of war, the fear of truth. Because truth had a way of surviving, no matter how deeply it was buried, no matter how many people tried to hide it. And after years of silence, the truth was finally rising to the surface. The prince stood beside the young woman in a secluded chamber deep within the palace. Spread across the table before them were documents, records, notes, and observations gathered over many years. Some had been forgotten, some had been hidden, some had nearly been destroyed. Yet together they formed a complete picture. For the first time, every piece finally connected. The missing royal official, the secret meetings, the vanished records, the financial corruption, the manipulation of information, the campaign of intimidation, everything pointed toward the same source. The prince stared at the evidence. His hands remained steady. A remarkable change from the frightened boy who once avoided attention. Fear still existed. Of course it did, but something stronger now stood beside it. Confidence. Not confidence in power, confidence in truth. And for the first time in his life, he trusted himself. The young woman watched him carefully. She could see the transformation clearly. The lonely child who once believed his thoughts held no value was gone. In his place stood someone stronger, someone who finally understood his worth. Yet neither celebrated. Not yet, because the most difficult part still remained. The truth had to reach the king, and that would not be easy. The individual responsible for years of corruption remained powerful, influential, respected. If they moved too soon, everything could be destroyed. If they waited too long, the truth might disappear forever. The decision had to be perfect. By dawn, events began moving faster than either expected. Unknown to them, the Alpha King had reached his own conclusion. Weeks of suspicious activity, contradictory reports, missing documents, strange orders issued without approval, the growing isolation of his son. All of it had finally become impossible to ignore. The king had spent years convincing himself that distance protected the kingdom. Now he was beginning to understand a painful reality. Distance had blinded him. While he focused on external threats, corruption had quietly grown within his own walls, and his son had seen it all. The realization haunted him. For years, he believed the prince needed protection. Now he understood the opposite. The prince had been protecting truths nobody else noticed. Later that morning, a private audience was requested. The king agreed. What followed would change the kingdom forever. The young woman entered first. The prince followed beside her. Several trusted guards secured the chamber. No advisors, no nobles, no council members, only the king. At first, silence filled the room. The king looked at his son, really looked at him. Perhaps for the first time in years, the prince met his gaze. Neither moved, neither spoke. The distance that had existed between them for so long suddenly felt painfully visible. The young woman began presenting the evidence, carefully, methodically, one piece at a time. Documents, records, witness accounts, patterns, connections. At first, the king's expression remained controlled, then concern appeared, then disbelief, then anger. Not directed at them, directed at himself, because every new revelation exposed another failure, another warning he missed, another truth he ignored, and at the center of everything stood the son he had spent years overlooking. The final piece came from the prince. The memory, the confrontation, the meeting witnessed years earlier, the detail only he remembered, the detail nobody else possessed, the detail that connected everything. The room fell silent. The king stared at the evidence spread before him. The truth could no longer be denied. The corruption was real, the betrayal was real, and the person responsible had hidden behind loyalty for years. The king's jaw tightened. For several moments nobody spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The king looked directly at his son, not at the evidence, not at the young woman, at his son. Pain filled his eyes. Deep pain, the kind that comes when a person finally confronts their own mistakes. The prince felt his heart pounding. Years of disappointment stood between them, years of silence, years of loneliness. Yet in that moment, neither thought about politics, neither thought about corruption, neither thought about power. They thought about each other. A father, a son, separated by fear for far too long. The king's expression broke, not dramatically, not publicly, quietly, humanly. He finally understood what he had lost and what his son had endured. The investigations began immediately. Once the evidence reached trusted officials, the hidden network collapsed faster than anyone expected. People who had spent years relying on secrecy suddenly found themselves exposed. Documents resurfaced, witnesses stepped forward, old lies unraveled. The truth spread throughout the palace, then throughout the kingdom. Shock followed, anger followed, but so did admiration. Because alongside the story of corruption emerged another story. A story people could not stop discussing. The story of the silent prince. The prince nobody listened to. The prince everyone underestimated. The prince who remembered what everyone else forgot. Citizens across the kingdom heard the tale. At first, many refused to believe it. Then more details emerged, more evidence, more confirmations. Eventually, disbelief became respect, and respect became something greater. The people began seeing him differently. Not as a weakness, not as a burden, not as someone defined by what he lacked, but as someone defined by what he possessed. Patience, wisdom, awareness, courage. Qualities that could not be measured by a voice. The transformation spread quickly. For the first time in his life, the prince no longer felt invisible. Yet the most important moment arrived days later, not in a courtroom, not during an investigation, not before the kingdom, but within the palace itself. A formal gathering had been arranged. Nobles, officials, military leaders, representatives from every major territory. The hall filled with people, the same hall where the prince once stood alone while others looked past him, the same hall where servants quietly guided him away from attention, the same hall where nobody truly saw him. Now every eye focused on him. The prince stood beside the Alpha King. Thousands of emotions moved through him at once. Nervousness, disbelief, hope, fear, pride. The king stepped forward. Silence filled the chamber. Then he did something nobody expected, something far more powerful than any speech. He acknowledged his failure, openly, publicly, without excuses, without avoiding responsibility. He admitted he had allowed fear to shape his relationship with his son. He admitted he had failed to listen, failed to understand, failed to see what stood before him all along. The hall remained silent. Many looked stunned. Kings rarely confessed mistakes, but the king continued. And then he spoke about the prince. Not as a symbol, not as an heir, as a person, a son. He spoke about strength, true strength, the kind that survives loneliness, the kind that survives rejection, the kind that continues observing when the world refuses to listen. By the time he finished, many throughout the hall struggled to hide their emotions. The prince stood frozen. Years of pain seemed to crack apart inside him. Not disappearing, healing. Slowly, finally. The king turned toward him. For a moment, neither moved. Then the distance that had separated them for so many years finally disappeared. The embrace was simple, yet it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. The hall erupted, not because corruption had been exposed, not because justice had prevailed, because everyone understood what they had just witnessed, a father finding his son, and a son discovering he was worthy of being found. The young woman watched from nearby. A quiet smile appeared. She asked for no recognition, expected no reward. Seeing the prince stand confidently before the kingdom was enough, because this had never been about politics. It had never been about power. It had always been about one lonely child learning that his voice mattered. As the gathering ended and people slowly departed, the prince stepped onto a balcony overlooking the capital city. The sun was setting. Golden light stretched across rooftops and distant hills. The kingdom looked different now, not because the buildings had changed, because he had changed. For years he believed silence made him less. Now he understood something far greater. A voice was not measured by sound. A voice was measured by truth, and his truth had changed an entire kingdom. Below, citizens moved through the streets, unaware that history had quietly shifted. Above them stood a prince who had once been invisible, a prince who had once believed nobody would ever listen. Now the future stretched before him, uncertain, vast, full of possibility. The young woman joined him on the balcony. Neither needed words. The setting sun painted the horizon gold. For a while they simply stood there together, watching, thinking, remembering. And somewhere deep within the royal palace, old shadows finally began fading, not because darkness had disappeared forever, but because someone had finally chosen to see it. The silent prince had found his voice. The kingdom had finally listened, and this was only the beginning.